Welcome to Starbound. My name is James Victor, and I will be your narrator today. If you enjoy human-created HFY stories just like this one and want to support us, we are now on Patreon. There you will receive access to exclusive stories you won't hear anywhere else. The link is in the description. Now, without further ado, I implore that you listen and enjoy. 1 hour out from the boundary, Fleet Captain Villeneuve sat alone in his quarters, with the lights brought down to reading amber and the ledger open on the desk before him. The ledger was paper. That mattered. The fleet kept its records in archive cores, indexed and cross-referenced, retrievable in less time than it took to form the request, and every officer of his rank carried the whole of naval history in a band on the wrist. None of that was the point. Lo-Rian doctrine held that a lost ship received a physical entry, written by hand, in a book that could be held. Grief required mass. A datum that weighed nothing could be set aside by a species that had built its civilization on lanes and currents and the keeping of accounts, and so the dead were given weight, deliberately, 1 page at a time, filled 31 pages. He turned them slowly, though he knew every line the way he knew the joints of his own 6-fingered hands. The tide mark, survey tender, crew of 12 entered the sector and did not leave it. The coastal meridian, bulk hauler, crew of 40, entered the sector and did not leave it. 29 more, from a dozen species in 11 scripts, every one transcribed into the ledger in his own careful hand, because the originals belonged to navies that were not his, and grief, like cargo, traveled better when it was properly stowed. Each entry was the same in the ways that it should have been different. No debris field, no sustained distress signal, no wreckage recovered for analysis, no bodies. A ship crossed the boundary, and then there was no ship. The official classification ran to 4 words: navigation hazard, cause unknown. 40 years of charts carried it, in 11 scripts, and the careful borderless phrasing of a galaxy that had agreed to stop asking. Traffic went around. The corridor that had once carried a measurable fraction of trans-arm shipping now carried nothing at all, and the diversion had been priced, normalized, and absorbed into the cost of doing business the way his people absorbed everything. A hazard was weather. Weather was entered into the models, and the models were obeyed. 4 investigations had been mounted before his. He had read all 4 files. Each one had assembled at the boundary, taken its readings, found nothing that justified the risk of proceeding, and turned home with its conclusions intact and its hull intact, and nothing whatsoever to show for either. He had simply been chosen because he was the officer most likely to do what they had not, and he intended to. 3 of the 31 pages were Lo-Rian, the pale current, the standing measure, the long account. He had written the notification letters for 2 of them himself, as a younger officer with better penmanship and fewer doubts, and he could still recall the texture of the paper. 12 more pages belonged to allied navies, and the allies had begun, in the way of allies, to ask their questions in the open sessions of the assembly rather than the closed ones. A generational mystery had become a political liability. The assembly required an answer it could enter into a record, and so it had sent the officer it considered the best it had, which was a fact he carried without vanity, the way one carries a tide table. The human war did not enter into it. The war was real, but it was remote. A cold thing conducted in distant corridors for decades, flaring and settling like a season, and no one had ever connected the Brest-Tal losses to it, because Brest-Tal losses were filed under weather. He believed, as a matter of doctrine and of temperament, that every loss had an explanation. He believed that every explanation could be found if one looked carefully enough, and that the looking was a duty owed to the names in the book. A loss was a datum. A datum belonged to a pattern, and a pattern once found resolved the entry into a clean final state. The way a current, once charted, stopped being a mystery and became a rout. He had 31 data points. Somewhere inside them was a shape. He had spent 30 years finding shapes in fewer points than that, and the sector, whatever it held, was no different in kind from any strait or shoal his people had ever charted. It was only larger and quieter. He closed the ledger and did not file it. He set it down on the desk, squared neatly to the edge, where it would be close at hand. The comms chimed. Miss Cece from the bridge, his voice level in the way it went level when he disapproved of something he intended to do anyway. The boundary threshold was 20 minutes out. Villeneuve acknowledged, dressed his uniform collar, and regarded his own hands for a moment in the amber light. Deep naval blue, darkening at the knuckles and joints, steady. A species that had never needed to rush did not begin rushing now. He took the corridor forward at a walking pace and arrived composed. The bridge crew straightened as he entered, and Miss Cece yielded the command rail with the small formal bow he reserved these days for missions he disliked. The crossing itself offered nothing. No drama, no visible threshold, no shimmer on the forward screens. The sector looked like space, because it was space, black and indifferent, and exactly as charted. The instruments confirmed the expected signature, a low ambient energy reading, slightly depressed against the surrounding volume, noted in every survey for 40 years and explained by none of them. His transponder broadcast their credentials into the dark, as doctrine required of any official vessel on any crossing anywhere, and the dark did not answer. He ordered 1/3 speed and a deeper heading. The crew obeyed. The boundary fell behind them without ceremony, which was, he noted, more than could be said for 31 ships before his. The wrongness arrived slowly, and it did not arrive through the instruments. The sector felt empty in a way that open space did not. Open space was indifferent. This was vacant. It had the stillness of a harbor cleared before a storm, of a room from which something had been carefully removed. He stood at the command rail, studied readouts that insisted nothing was wrong, and found that his secondary membranes had drawn closed, vertically, across both eyes, without his instruction. He let them stay where they were. They were older than doctrine, and they had their reasons. 20 minutes inside, Miss Cece spoke from the sensor station, and his voice had changed registers. The first anomaly. The low energy reading was not uniform. It carried structure, faint but consistent. A slow modulation that repeated across the volume on a period of some minutes, present in every band they sampled. Not interference, not an artifact of the instruments, which had been calibrated twice on his orders before crossing the boundary. The sector's emptiness had a rhythm to it, very deep and very slow, and the nearest language the sensor suite offered for it was respiration, as if something very large was breathing, somewhere out in the dark, with no interest at all in being heard. Villeneuve leaned forward over the rail. The membranes closed again, and this time he had to instruct them to open. The drain announced itself politely. 0.03% across every board at once, a deviation so small a less calibrated ship would never have registered it, and a less calibrated crew would have logged it for the morning watch. Villeneuve saw it because Miss Cece saw it, and Miss Cece saw it because the instruments had been calibrated twice before the crossing on the fleet captain's orders. Engineering flagged it within the minute. External attachment on the hull, multiple contact points, distributed, nature unknown. His first instinct was the correct instinct for 40 years of ordinary space, and the wrong instinct for this sector, which was to think of fouled sensor heads and debris adhesion and the mundane housekeeping of any vessel that moved through a universe full of dust. He ordered a diagnostic sweep and a second opinion. The drain doubled before the sweep completed. Then it doubled again, and engineering, following doctrine as engineering should, brought reactor output up to compensate, and the drain rose to meet the new output with a smoothness that no fault, no leak, and no damage profile in any manual he had ever studied could produce. Power went out. More drain came back. The relationship was direct, proportional, and patient, and he stood at the command rail and watched the two curves climb his display in lockstep, and understood that he was not looking at a malfunction. A malfunction does not respond. This responded. He did not know what was on his hull. He knew the shape of what was happening, and the shape looked like a feeding. The feedback loop crossing his display gave him perhaps 30 seconds before cascade. He ordered full power down. Everything. Drives, reactor, grid, life support to passive reserve. Miss Cece turned from his station, and his objection arrived fully formed, because Lorian objections always did. Unknown sector, unknown contacts on the hull. A full power down was a death sentence if anything in this volume was hostile. And everything they knew about this volume said that something was. He was not wrong. He was not even imprudent. He was simply spending seconds, and there were 30 of them, and Villeneuve did not argue, did not explain, and did not raise his voice, because a species that has never needed to rush does not begin in the last 30 seconds of its ship's life. Full power down. Now. The bridge died around them in the correct order, board by board, and the emergency lighting came up low and amber. The drives went silent through the deck plating, in a long descending note that every spacefarer feels in the bones and hopes never to feel again. The ship became a drifting object. The ship became, by every measure the sector could read, a thing already dead. The drain stopped climbing. Villeneuve crossed the silent bridge to the nearest viewport and looked out, and saw them. They covered the hull. A continuous translucent sheet laid across the plating from the bow back toward the drive housing, made of bodies, each one smaller than his hand, each one nearly invisible alone and unmistakable together. A living skin stretched over his vessel with a faint, slow pulse moving through it in waves. They were not breaching. They were not probing the locks or the seams. They had settled against the residual warmth of his cooling systems the way swimmers settle into a current, and they fed. And the pulse that moved through them was the pulse of a thing digesting, not a thing hunting, not attacking, eating. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not step back from the glass. He stood with the amber light behind him and the dark ahead of him, and he did what he had been sent 400 light years to do, which was to observe, carefully, and write it down. Colonial organization, coordinated without any visible signal. Density greatest at the drive housing where the warmth was. Wave period regular. Individual size, 1 hand or less. Nothing about them suggested malice, and nothing about them needed to. Response to output proportional and immediate. He built the file in his mind, page by page, in his own careful hand, because if he lived, the ledger was going to need it, and if he did not, the habit would at least keep him standing still. Then the music started. It came through the comms receiver, which sat on the emergency bus and had stayed faithfully alive in the dark, and it was a broadcast, external, high amplitude, on no channel and in no protocol his people used. It was not language, it was not signal traffic, it was something older and more physical than either. A raw electric charge built into sound, a driving rhythmic pulse that climbed and broke into a hammering rhythm that had no analogy in anything he had ever heard. His membranes drew fully closed, his hands tightened on the rail, and outside the viewport, the sheet of bodies answered it. They peeled off his hull in a single flowing movement, every organism at once, with no laggards and no stragglers, the whole translucent skin lifting away from the plating and pouring outward into the dark like a tide reversing, and they went toward the source of the broadcast at a speed that made his sensor's memory of them seem slanderous. In under 2 minutes, his hull was bare. The drain on his boards, had his boards been alive to show it, would have read 0. The human vessel decloaked off the port bow, mid-sized, a working profile, neither sleek nor new, hull plating patched and weathered and plainly maintained by people who cared more for the ship than for its appearance. Its running lights came up in sequence, deliberately, the way a vessel lights itself when it wishes to be looked at. No weapons ports opened, no targeting emissions touched its hull. It simply sat there, in the middle of the most lethal volume on 40 years of charts, glowing, unhurried, while the music from its deployed drone thundered on and the creatures streamed towards it and wrapped it like a garment it had worn before. The voice, when it came in Lorian, accented slightly in a way no translator implant produces. Learned speech, shaped by a living mouth that had taken the trouble. "Fleet Captain Villeneuve, please don't restart your drives just yet. Give them another 2 minutes to clear completely. My name is Fleet Admiral H. Horace Nelson. Welcome to the Brestal sector. We have been expecting you for some time. I will explain everything. I find it goes better when I explain everything. Please come aboard when you are ready. Bring your first officer, if you like. Leave your weapons aboard, if you would." Silence again, except for the music. Fainter now. Ending. Villeneuve looked across the amber bridge at Missisi. His first officer stood at his dead station with both membranes drawn fully closed, blind by reflex, a man whose body had decided for him that he did not wish to see the next thing. Villeneuve's own membranes were open. He noted the difference and filed it, and did not yet know which of them it spoke better of. He gave the order to hold the power down and stand the crew easy. Then he went to his quarters and picked up his coat and picked up the ledger. His drives restarted clean once the hull was clear. Nelson's vessel took station close alongside, running whatever signature it ran, and the swarm parted around the two hulls together and touched neither. Villeneuve watched the creatures divide ahead of them and close again behind, a living corridor through the dark, and understood that the most lethal volume on 40 years of charts had become, for this crossing, an escort. He did not yet have a word for that either. The station kept its secret until the last possible moment, and then gave it up all at once. One moment the forward screens held empty space, the next they held a structure the size of a port city, resolving out of the dark as the colony's feeding thinned ahead of them. And his sensor officer said something quiet and devout in a dialect Villeneuve had not known he spoke. A pinnace crossed from Nelson's vessel shortly after, running light steady, and held position off the forward lock. Nelson was aboard the pinnace himself. He was lean, unhurried, and his uniform had been repaired in at least 4 places by someone with strong seams and no interest in concealment. His right sleeve was pinned at the shoulder. A patch covered his right eye, plain and dark. He carried all of it the way the ship outside carried its patched plating, without apology. He shook Villeneuve's hand in the human fashion, but with his left hand, and made no point of the gesture. Shook Missisi's hand the same way, and offered them both something hot to drink before anyone said a word about ships or creatures or 40 years. Then he said, plainly, before they moved a step further, their vessel had not been boarded. It would not be boarded. Their crew remained their own, their comms remained open, and Missisi was free to return to his ship via the pinnace at any moment he chose, including this one. Missisi chose this one, not as a prisoner chooses, as a man who had seen the sheet of bodies lift off his hull, and had decided, with full possession of himself, that he did not wish to learn what came next. He stayed aboard the pinnace, formally, as if it were a duty station, and Villeneuve let him have the dignity of that. He went inside Nelson's vessel alone, with the human. The station revealed itself in stages. From outside, until the last few kilometers, there had been nothing, a void on every instrument. Nelson's vessel docked without ceremony, the way a ship comes home to a berth it has used 1,000 times. From the inside, the station was immense, deck upon deck falling away below the gallery walks, and Nelson explained it, without being asked, in the manner of a man honoring a promise. The colony surrounded the station's outer shell. The colony ate its emissions, every band, every signature. The station had no technology of concealment. It had neighbors, and nothing crossed the sector boundary in or out, except aboard a human-tuned hull. The colony was the wall. Villeneuve noted it and said nothing yet. The manifest room came first. Records, floor to ceiling, physical and digital both. Nelson pulled the primary manifest, a bound volume nearly the twin of the one under Villeneuve's arm, and set it on the table between them. 40 years. Every vessel that had entered the sector. Date of entry, species of origin, vessel class, condition on capture, current status. Villeneuve opened his ledger to the first page and read the entry aloud. Name, class, crew, date, in the formal cadence of remembrance, because that was what the entry was for. Nelson turned the manifest to the matching record without looking down at it. He knew the page. He knew, it became apparent over the next hour, every page, and they went through all 31 of them. The human matching each of Villeneuve's dead to a line of living ink. Refitting and operational, under repair, cannibalized for parts, stated in the same even tone as the rest, a fate and not a confession. 3 entries were flagged in a different color, the Lorient vessels. Nelson closed the manifest with his hand flat on the cover. "I would like to show you something," he said, "before we discuss those 3. The observation gallery looked out over the interior docking bay. The bay was the size of a small city, and it was full of ships. Villeneuve recognized classes from a dozen species. Then he recognized vessels, specific vessels, whose loss he had filed personally, whose notification letters he had written with his own hand as a young officer, hulls he knew from photographs clipped to grief reports, here lit, maintained, reflagged in human colors, some of them visibly improved upon. The pale Current sat in a cradle, with her drive housings open, her registry repainted, and she had never, in 40 years of his believing otherwise, stopped existing. Somewhere on his homeworld, there were 2 letters in his own handwriting, explaining that she was gone. He made no sound. He stood at the gallery window and looked at the fleet for a long time, and his membranes closed once, slowly, and opened again, and that was the whole of what he permitted the moment. His first question, when it came, was why no one had ever come to claim them back. Nelson's answer had no triumph in it. "Because no one knew there was anything to claim." The manifest was not a public record. The losses had been filed as natural disaster by the people who suffered them, and to the rest of the galaxy, these ships did not exist anymore. His second question was how many species knew of this operation. "1," Nelson said. "Just us." His third question was the crews, and Nelson, instead of answering, took him down to the residential levels. The station had a population, several hundred individuals from more than a dozen species, on decks that had the worn, comfortable texture of a place where people had lived a long time and stopped thinking of it as temporary. There was a school. There was a market with prices argued in several languages at once, and a notice board offering drive parts, music lessons, fresh produce, and someone's outgrown boots. There were children, some of them born here, running a corridor with the entitlement of natives, and there was Asavan, Lorient chief engineer, deep naval blue gone deeper with age, darkest at the joints, who had arrived 9 years ago aboard one of the 3 flagged entries and who now commanded a workshop the size of a hangar, a team of 12, and a standing argument with Nelson about drive calibration that both of them plainly maintained for the pleasure of it. He did not look like a man waiting to be rescued. He looked like a man who knew where every tool in the room was, and had opinions about most of them. Villeneuve asked him directly, "Do you want to leave?" Asavan considered it with genuine seriousness. He said that the secondary drive housing on the 3rd Lorient vessel had been running 2% low since the refit, that it had been bothering him considerably, and that he intended to finish the calibration. "After that," he said, "I am open to discussing the question." Villeneuve filed the answer. He did not yet know which column it belonged in. He was beginning to suspect his ledger did not contain the column, Back on the operations level, Nelson refilled their drinks, sat down across from him, and waited. Villeneuve used it, and then asked the only question left.
"What happens now?"
"Nothing changes on my end," Nelson said. The operation continued. The sector stayed marked as a hazard, the fleet grew modestly, since vessels that crossed a 40-year warning were a self-selecting group, and the colony went on keeping the walls. The question, he said, was what changed on Villeneuve's end, and he asked it because in 40 years Villeneuve was the first official investigator ever to make it this far, and Nelson appeared to find him the most interesting thing the sector had produced in a decade. Villeneuve looked at his ledger, at the manifest, at the fleet, twinkling quietly in the viewport glass. 31 entries, 31 answers, not one of them the answer he had come 400 light-years to find. He asked for time to think.
"Of course," Nelson said. "You are not going anywhere tonight, anyway."
That evening, Nelson took him to the outer observation deck, the one that faced the sector and not the fleet, and turned the lights down without being asked. The creatures were visible from there, not as a sheet now, not as a skin over a dying hull, but as themselves, drifting in slow colony rivers through the dark, feeding on the thin ambient energy of the volume the way grazing animals feed on a sparse plain. From this distance, they were beautiful, a faint translucent shimmer across the black, pulsing in long patterns, and Villeneuve found that he was already beginning to read the patterns, the way one begins to read a current after enough hours on the water, and he filed it. Nelson told him how it started. It had not been a plan, he said. It had been an accident. The first vessel ever to take the corridor had been a human survey ship, undermanned, under-equipped, behind schedule, and her master had read the empty charts and taken the sector as a shortcut, because it was there and nothing said otherwise. The drain began 2 hours in. The crew did what trained crews do, which was push the drives to compensate, and the drain rose to meet them, and the ship was dying by the same patient arithmetic Villeneuve had watched climb his own displays. One crew member read the arithmetic differently, a junior navigator, second posting, who looked at the curves and saw a feeding instead of a failure, and who convinced the captain, with 30 seconds left to decide, and every officer senior to him objecting, to order full power down. The ship went dark. The creatures settled into a low feed on her cooling systems, and the crew sat in that darkness for 6 hours, waiting to die, while the junior navigator stood at a viewport and watched the things feeding on his ship's energy, and took notes. He survived. He came back with a science team, then a longer posting, then a music library, a broadcast array, and a theory. Along the way came the discovery that mattered most, that the creatures answered specific frequencies in both directions, drawn to some outputs and repelled by others, and that a vessel tuned to the right standing signature could cross the sector without ever being touched. Human ships ran that signature now as routine output. The swarm let them pass the way a river lets a stone sit in it.
"That junior navigator," Nelson said, "was me."
He had been here for all 40 years the sector had been on the hazard charts. His survey ship had been the first vessel ever to take the corridor. The mystery and the man were the same age, and every one of the 31 entries in Villeneuve's ledger had happened on his watch. Villeneuve stood with that for a while. The accident and the architect were the same person, and the sector had never had two stories, only one. He asked about the music. Why that piece?
2 years of trials, Nelson said.
They had tried everything: classical works, military signal patterns, industrial output, pure sign sweeps. Nothing produced more than a local stir, until the day someone in the science team, for reasons Nelson described as cultural, broadcast a piece of old human music called Thunderstruck. And the entire test swarm crossed 9 kilometers in 90 seconds and wrapped the array like a fist. The working theory held that the opening build of the piece escalated in a pattern resembling, in some electromagnetic sense, a bloom of stellar radiation the creatures had evolved to chase. Nelson offered the theory with the honesty of a man who knew the difference between a working theory and an explanation, and then said the only thing he was sure of.
It works.
Villeneuve looked out at the slow rivers in the dark and thought about 40 years. About patience as a strategic resource, about a junior navigator standing in a viewport in a dying ship, 6 hours in the dark, with the things that were killing him, thinking not how do I escape, but what are you, and taking notes. His people charted hazards in order to go around them. This species had sat down inside one and asked it questions until it answered. He thought about Asavan in his hangar. He thought about the population of the station, the several hundred, the children, the market, and about the two kinds of resident it must hold, those who had arrived against their will and stayed by choice, and those who had arrived against their will, and those who had arrived against their will and were simply still there, and how the two were indistinguishable from the outside, and how that indistinguishability was now also an entry in his keeping, and would not resolve either. He opened the ledger to the first low Rion page, the pale current. He looked at the column heading his people had used for 40 years. Lost. He did not cross it out. He did not write over it. He had spent 30 years believing that every loss had an explanation, and that an explanation, found and verified, resolved an entry into a clean final state, the way a charted current stops being a mystery and becomes a route. The explanation had been found. It was downstairs, lit, maintained, 2% low on OneDrive housing, and the entry did not resolve. It opened into something larger and more complicated than any word he had.
For what it's worth, Nelson said quietly, we have a word for it. We have had the word for it for millennia. We used it so much, it became policy.
Villeneuve looked at him.
Prize, Nelson said.
Villeneuve turned the word over. It was not a low Rion word, and it did not map onto any category in his doctrine. It was not trophy, because no one had been shown. It was not salvage, because nothing had been wrecked. It was not conquest, because nothing had been declared. It sat between all three, and meant something that needed all three to approach, and none of them to define. And his language, which had a word for every way a ship could be lost, had no word at all for this way of being found. He asked his last question. The creatures, what do you call them? Nelson told him, AC/DC. Villeneuve did not know the reference. He did not know the band, or the terminology, or the joke, and he heard something in the word regardless. A pulse, a charge, the signature of a thing named by someone who had understood it well enough to laugh. He heard somewhere under it the music that had peeled them off his hull, the opening build of something he would never entirely understand, and never entirely forget. He closed the ledger.